Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series, Can We Save the Oakland A's? And we are just past the midway point of the 2038 season. 3 games out in the AL West behind who else? The Texas Rangers, who have dominated our division and, quite honestly, dominated baseball for about the past 5 or 6 seasons. We are 7 games up on the final wild card spot in the American League, so still very well positioned to guide these A's back to the playoffs for a 8th time in the past 10 seasons, but clearly would love to put ourselves in a position where we don't have to play in a wild card series for just the 2nd time in that run. And to do that, we're going to have to get by the Rangers and, of course, obviously also secure one of the top 2 records in the American League. Fortunately, the AL Central is not particularly strong this year. The Twins at 42-37 lead the division. So in theory, whoever wins the East, most likely the Yankees or the Rays, and whoever wins the West, most likely the Rangers or ourselves, will have the first round byes in the AL this year. And I mentioned in our last episode when we did our mid-season review of the A's that there's 2 relatively obvious positions I think I'd like to try to improve in the trade market over the next 4+ weeks before we get to the trade deadline. Catcher Jaden Boakai is actually having a pretty respectable year for us with a 1 WAR and close to league average offense combined with excellent defense. But I still think we could upgrade that position. And third base, where Anufo Dolan has been disappointing since we picked him up in a trade with Cleveland just about a year ago, is a clear area that we could try to upgrade. He's been well below average offensively this year and a bit below replacement level. The tricky factor with Big Baby Dolan, as I noted, is that he is the only captain personality we have on our team right now. So moving on from him would either leave us with a little bit of a potential hole in the clubhouse in terms of keeping everyone motivated and keeping things working as efficiently as possible, unless we happen to bring another captain on board in a trade, which is certainly something that we are going to be thinking about. Several interesting comments to the last episode. I noted at the end of the episode that Juan Ramos, even though our A's have only played 82 games, has played 83 games for us this year. I assumed it was a game that there were some weather issues and was hoping that it was not a bug. Peter Hooper commented and was basically hoping the same thing, and I did go through the game log, and it was kind of what I thought it was. It looks like back in April, there is a game that we started at Cleveland where he actually has walked a couple of times and scored a couple of runs, even though he doesn't have an official at-bat. We've got a 6-0 lead in that game, and it's going to be completed on September 6th. So nothing wrong with the game. It's just that because Ramos is our DH, goes out there and plays every day for us, I noticed that he had an extra game compared to what we have in the 1-loss column at this point, but no harm, no foul, and best case scenario is he'll play 162 games, including the end of that game at Cleveland by the time we get to the end of this season. And Peter Hooper, along with Wyme943, Paul West, and Avery Shaham, all provided some interesting thoughts and perspectives on what we should potentially think about doing in the trade market this year. Not just at third base and catcher, but also some comments on other positions on our team and other guys who are on the trade block right now. I think the general consensus kind of agreed with me that the trade block right now is not particularly interesting. Did get a suggestion to potentially shop Juan Ramos and see what we could get for him. He is clearly a very important person to our lineup, and I made the point back in the comments that Ramos we still have locked up for another year. He's got solid trade value, as you would expect, but clearly with the trade settings we're playing on, we're not going to get a bat as similar to his in return. So I think I'm inclined to keep Ramos. But Andy Brailovsky, I could be convinced to let go of. He's the other big left-handed hitter in our lineup, having a similar season this year to Ramos with the 125 WRC plus. But Brailovsky actually is headed to free agency at the end of this season. And right now, he's looking for 6 years at over $17 million a year. It is his 29th birthday today, so happy birthday, Andy. I don't necessarily want to move on from either of them because, as I noted, they are the two left-handers that we have in our lineup against right-handed pitching. Although, to be fair, with Landin, Ortega, and Dolan for the time being, we do have 3 switch hitters, which would certainly help if we moved on from one of them. But they both do have useful trade value, and although I don't feel great about playing Ramos at first base, he's not as good there defensively as Brailovsky is, which is why Brailovsky's been our first baseman and Ramos has been our DH. Given that we do have that team control of Ramos for another year and a half, whereas we'll likely be moving on from Brailovsky after this season, I think I'm potentially a little bit more willing to maybe deal Brailovsky if we end up in a scenario where we decide to move on from one of those guys. And although our starting pitching and our pitching in general is excellent, we've been following the career of the knuckleballer Andres Rojas since the 2027 draft, and the ace knuckleballer who's 9-6 this year with an ERA of about 3 has already put up a 2.3 WAR. Last year of that massive contract where he's getting paid $55 million a season, we explored the options for him at the end of the last episode, and as much as I'd love to have him on board, the price to rent him is just prohibitive at this point. So not something that we are realistically going to think about doing. Did, as I mentioned, get a lot of interesting comments on how to perhaps pursue the next month as we approach the trade deadline from that quartet of the Worldwide Scouting Department: Shayam, Hooper, West, and Wyme. And one catcher does stand out to me as potentially interesting. Not a perfect scenario, but Malcolm Moore, a catcher from the Royals, has the captain personality that we need, is outstanding defensively, even though his arm is bad, is not a particularly good hitter, but he is a left-handed batter, and we look at his ratings. There's reason to think he's going to be a lot more effective against right-handed pitching than left-handed pitching. So in theory, we could bring somebody like Moore on board and platoon him with Boakai, play Moore against righties, Boakai, the right-handed hitter, against lefties, and likely generate some more offense. Moore, a 96 WRC plus over the course of his career, but an 82 against lefties, and he's been basically a league average offensive player against righties over the course of his career. So would certainly upgrade us offensively against right-handed pitching. He would give us the captain personality that we need if we decide to pivot from Dolan at third base, and would give us great defense as well. So there's a lot to like about him. He's also not particularly expensive. But part of the reason he's not particularly expensive, small part of the reason is probably his well below average arm. But more importantly, he's going to be 35 years old on the trade deadline. He's fragile physically, and he's in the final year of his contract making $24.4 million. So he would be a pure rental if we wanted to bring him on board. Like I said, though, there's definitely a lot of avenues to bring him on board, and he's not particularly expensive if we did want to pursue something with Mr. Moore. And although he is making $24.4 million, the Royals got the Marlins to already retain 100% of his salary. So even though he's a pure rental, he would not actually end up costing us any money. Can see for whatever reason, he's a guy who's been in the majors for over a decade, and we've only got average scouting accuracy on him. So we are trying to get an updated scouting report on him. But Moore, to me, is a pure rental, but a pretty simple and relatively cheap way to improve our catcher position for this year. There is, however, a much more interesting way for the medium to long term to try to improve our catcher position, and that's Jorge Mendoza of the Minnesota Twins organization, making the major league minimum this year, but set to be making over $5 million in arbitration next year. He is a left-handed hitting catcher, although his profile is pretty much identical between left-handed and right-handed pitching. But over the course of parts of 4 seasons in the majors at this point, he's put up a 122 WRC plus, so he is a very good offensive catcher. He is not as good defensively as either Boakai or Ackley. And with the fact that he's headed to arbitration and going to make about $5 million in his first arbitration year, he's going to be much more expensive than either of those guys over the next 3 years. But we've definitely struggled offensively behind the plate in recent seasons, and bringing on Mendoza would give us another left-handed hitter in the lineup. We've been so reliant on pitching that I'm a little reticent to bring on a catcher who's not quite as good defensively as Ackley or Boakai, but Mendoza is still an above-average catcher. Another guy that we're trying to get an updated scouting report on, Mendoza would be significantly more expensive than Mr. Moore to bring on board, but he is also a guy who's a lot younger, healthier, and will be with us for at least 3.5 seasons before he potentially hits free agency. Negative is that Mendoza does not have that captain personality, so he would not allow us to as seamlessly move on from Mr. Dolan at third base as Mr. Moore might. And he's not as good defensively, as we talked about. But he's also more expensive. He can see straight up in a trade. We basically need to give one of the best players on our team or one of the top prospects in our organization to bring him on board. I think there's packages we could put together that would be a little more palatable than giving up any of our true blue chip prospects or any of our excellent major leaguers who are signed to really good contracts, which generally is the opportunity set that the Twins are willing to take for Mendoza. But I do kind of feel like there is an option for us to, through Mr. Moore or Mr. Mendoza, potentially make a pretty material upgrade to our catcher position. Mendoza is a clear offensive upgrade. Moore is an offensive upgrade against right-handed pitching, and a really strong defensive player with that captain personality as well. But it's not just catchers we're looking at. Given that I did do a little research on whether we could trade away Ramos or Brailovsky for anything, It seems like we could probably get Jake Bauers from the Red Sox. Now, he's not a perfect first baseman. He's 32 years old. He's fragile physically, only 6 feet tall, and not all that impressive defensively. And unlike Brailovsky or Ramos, who would be likely an important piece of a deal to bring Bauers on board, but we'd also need to include some pretty good prospects as well to bring him on board. He's a right-handed hitter, which isn't perfect for our lineup. He's set to make almost, or a little bit more actually, than $20 million a year on average over these next 4 years. And as I said, he's already 32 years old, so he's basically a little more expensive than we think Brailovsky will be next year. And he's older and he's a right-handed hitter. But we should be able to get the Red Sox to keep a chunk of his contract. Not a massive amount of his contract, but enough that he would be cheaper than Brailovsky. And Bauers also gives us that captain personality that we would need in the clubhouse if we're going to move on from Dolan. He's put up a 124 WRC plus over the course of his career. I worry a little bit bringing on a guy who's 32 years old for another 3.5 seasons, who's already fragile physically, not great defensively. If that bat gets worse quickly and he ages quickly, I don't think it's going to be a crippling contract to us. But if a year and a half from now I don't want to have him in the lineup because his bat's not as good and he doesn't bring anything to the table defensively, kind of defeats the purpose of bringing him on board to be our captain personality for the next few years. But he is the type of guy that we could potentially get for a Brailovsky or a Ramos. But again, it's also not a straight-up trade. We have to include some solid to very good prospects with him to get a potential deal done. You can see straight up, there's no one who makes it work straight up. That's largely because of the money situation. But if we were to get the Red Sox to keep 40% of his contract, the great Jake Ortega is the only guy who makes that deal work. So if we didn't go with Moore and we decided to go with the younger, better hitting catcher Mendoza, Bauers could be an option to maybe try to supplement in there with Mendoza to ensure that we do have a captain personality. But bringing both Mendoza and Bauers on board is going to require us to give up some pretty important prospects. Not necessarily one of the top handful of prospects in our organization, but multiple guys who look like they could be solid major leaguers, along with guys like Brailovsky or Ramos in the case of the Bauers trade, and likely an Ackley or a Boakai in the Mendoza trade. So I've mentioned catcher, mentioned first base, some options to get a different captain personality on the team. And if we were to do a trade to bring on Moore at catcher and or Bauers at first base / DH potentially, that would potentially give us the opportunity to move on from our third baseman, Mr. Dolan. And there's a couple interesting options to think about on that front as well. The simplest one is probably Amare Alcindor, the number 64 prospect in baseball, 8th round draft pick from 2032, having a solid season in AAA for us, hitting .291 with a 116 WRC plus. Not a ton of power, with 6 homers and 25 ribbies and just over 200 at-bats. But if we look at Alcindor's profile, even though we think he still has room to grow in terms of his contact, his BABIP, his gap power, and his home run power, I think he's certainly a better offensive player than Dolan right now. We'd likely end up putting him at second base and then pivoting Alejandro Landin over to third, given that Landin's got a better arm. Landin actually is also a bit better at turning double plays than Alcindor, so we're potentially weakening our infield defense a bit. But if we do make a trade to bring on another captain personality, Psycho Alcindor would be a pretty easy guy for us to bring up and replace Dolan in the lineup every day. And in theory, give us more offense. I don't think he's going to be a monster offensive player, but he can be better than Dolan. And there's also one guy that I've identified as a potential trade target who I think could help us at third base also. That's Stefan Tago, shortstop with the Nationals, making $4.4 million this year in his first arbitration year, going to be making around $8 million next year. So he's a guy who's getting expensive, but he's been, over the course of his major league career, an above average major league player, only slightly above average with the bat, but that again is a pretty big upgrade to what we have at third base right now with the Dolan and Mesidor platoon. And he's also got a pretty solid profile for a third baseman defensively. Not necessarily going to be cheap to bring Mr. Tago on board. A bit less expensive than Mendoza, but still generally looking for a very important major league player or a pretty highly regarded prospect in return to bring Mr. Tago on board. But that could be another option to upgrade our third base position if, again, we do make a trade for someone at another position with that captain personality. And we also could just decide not to have a captain personality team on the team. I rarely do that. I don't have a great quantitative understanding of the positive impact of having that captain personality on the team, but I've generally had reasonable level of success in the game by always ensuring that I have a captain personality on the team. So all else being equal, given that we are in a win now mode and we've got a really good team on the field, I want to try to keep the clubhouse as happy as possible. So I think my inclination is to ultimately bring on a player with a captain personality or keep a player with a captain personality in the lineup, all else being equal. But if you've got thoughts on that, would love to hear them. And if you've got thoughts on which direction you would go in the trade market or whether you would just stick with what we've got rather than making any of these potential trades, always helpful to hear that as well. I think I'm going to try to be patient over the next week or so of game time. Wait for those updated scouting reports, as we only had average or high scouting accuracy on most of the guys that we looked at. Hopefully their prices don't change materially over the next week, week and a half. Sometimes that can happen in the game, and I may kick myself if that happens. But I think there's some interesting options out there to make this team better for this season. And given that we are on pace to be one of the top teams in baseball, we're trying to get by the Rangers in the division, and we're ultimately hoping to not just be a playoff team, but hopefully playing deep into October and competing for a World Series title. I don't think it's unreasonable to try to supplement this already strong roster with some help over the next 4 weeks. So we're scouting those 4 players we mentioned who are outside of our organization. I think Tago, we already had very high scouting accuracy, but the others we were looking to get a more nuanced view. Hopefully it won't take full 2 weeks to get 4 scouting reports on established major leaguers. Probably not perfectly optimal that we are focused on that type of scouting rather than the rookie draft, but given our outstanding scouting department, you can see that we're already at very high scouting accuracy for just about everybody in the draft pool this year. And we unfortunately dropped 3 of 4 games on the road in Toronto, 2 on the road in Houston before we're home against Kansas City. And the draft will be taking place less than a week from now on Sunday the 11th as we're getting ready to finish that Kansas City series. Did get one of the scouting reports back on the veteran catcher Malcolm Moore. Only high scouting accuracy on him at this point. He's the cheapest guy out there. Would be a very easy addition to potentially improve our catcher position for this year. Since we've got those other guys that we're still waiting on, would love to get up to very high scouting accuracy. Again, I mean, he's a 34-year-old. He's got a very established track record as a major leaguer. Kansas City using him as a backup this year, and he's been very productive in that role, but clearly he's not happy with that role. I don't think we're going to get any real surprises in terms of his ratings, but do think that as a platoon player with Mr. Boakai, he could really be a nice addition to our lineup. Again, I don't love the arm, don't love the age, don't love the fragility, but the captain personality of the defense and the potential to really upgrade our offense against right-handed pitching at catcher is and are attractive features to me. And we made it to the first-year player draft. We dropped both games in Houston, which pushed our losing streak to 4 games. Fortunately, we did take 3 out of 4 at home against Kansas City, although we failed earlier today to get the sweep against the Royals. Mr. Tago, we already had a very high scouting accuracy on him. Doesn't look materially different than we thought he did. If he had a captain personality, he'd be even more attractive to potentially bring on board. I don't think he's an obvious clear need for us because we do potentially have Alcindor in-house to give us a little more offense in the infield if we're able to pick up another captain personality or just decide to do without. But depending on how things go over the coming weeks, Tago is certainly someone to think about. But we are now to the draft, and before we finish up this episode, we're going to take a look at who's available for us. We're not going to be picking for a while, but we'll take a look at the top handful of prospects. Number 5 prospect, and we're not expected to have the opportunity to draft any of these guys. Center fielder Steve Kuhn, switch hitter, potentially outstanding power hitter. He's a high schooler. Another center fielder, Ronnie Mernon, potentially outstanding contact, pretty good gap power, and potentially a really good eye. Nice personality, decent speed. Not going to hit a ton of home runs, but the left-hander looks like he could be a perennial 300 hitter who draws a lot of walks and gets some extra base hits. Another center fielder, college player, TJ Hall, left-handed hitting outfielder, good speed. Looks like he could hit some home runs. Not the same kind of ceiling as those guys. And honestly, for a guy who's 21 years old, would hope for a guy who's likely to be a top pick that his floor was a little higher than it looks right now. Shortstop, Steve Biscardi, the number 2 prospect. Looks like a potentially very interesting offensive player for a middle infielder with a pretty solid glove. And the number one prospect, again, not expecting any of these guys to be available for us, center fielder Eric Goss out of Jacksonville University. Looks like a potentially really interesting bat with pretty good speed. We'll see if any of these guys are on the board when it comes time for us to pick. But we're not going to be picking until 29th overall, so probably not going to see any of these guys on the board when we are finally on the clock. From the time that I've spent with the draft offline since the last episode, it looks like a pretty weak starting pitching draft. We are projected to pick second baseman Alfredo Sandoval Pusan of Hama. No clue what any of that means. Right-handed hitting high schooler. Looks like his bat could be borderline incredible if he reaches his full potential. Not the fastest player, not the greatest defensive second baseman out there, and a mixed personality, but he does have high adaptability and work ethic going for him. I'd be surprised if a guy with potentially 80 contact, 70 gap power, and 70 home run power is still on the board for us. Sandoval would certainly be an interesting guy to consider at number 29, but who knows whether or not he'll actually be available. But we will all actually know whether or not he will be available very shortly, because there's no point in us stressing out about who's going to be available and who's not going to be available, because one of the nice features about OOTP is I can click a button and instantly move through those first 28 picks of the draft. And having done so, Sandoval is still on the market. We'll start taking a look at a few pitchers. You can see there are a few college guys in the mix. Closer Steve Bryan, a 22-year-old. Don't like the personality, but looks like he could be a contributor at the major league level in very short order. Looks like he is a pure reliever, however. Another college player, Jamie Schroeder, out of Maranatha Baptist Bible. Good personality, good stamina, good at holding on runners. Just not particularly impressed with his stuff. Probably not a guy that I'd go for with a first-round pick, especially with that poor competition level, and he's almost 22 years old. 3 high schoolers have the highest ceilings of the pitchers available, but as I noted, it was not a very deep pitching pool at all this year. Kamani Houston, really negative personality with low adaptability, work ethic, and intelligence. Strong stamina, outstanding at holding on runners. We think his stuff could be well above average with average-ish movement and control if he fully developed. Personality combined with the fact that he's a high schooler. Only looking at a 3-pitch arsenal right now. Probably enough to make him not the guy that I would go with. But a 6'5" lefty who does have a high ceiling and is not looking for a lot of money is certainly interesting to think about. The other 2 guys who have the highest ceilings are relievers. Malachi Chioke, South African right-hander. I think his stuff could be filthy, but very concerned about his control, not great stamina. But the 19-year-old is already throwing in the mid-90s. And then Joe French, 18-year-old reliever. Curveball, a cutter, and a knuckle curve. Think his stuff could be filthy. Also with above-average movement and control. Not a ton of stamina, not great at holding on runners. But the 18-year-old also throws in the mid-90s already. So some interesting relievers, coupled with a couple of starters. If we had to go with a starter, I think I'd go with the higher ceiling of Houston over Schroeder, but I'm definitely not in love with either of them. I don't love Schroeder's stuff and his ceiling, and I really don't like Houston's personality. So we'll take a look at about 10 of the top hitting prospects. Only going to look at one 4-star prospect, the only college player. That's Sam Bashirs, a center fielder out of BYU. Good speed, respectable defensively, and an interesting bat if it fully develops. Don't know a lot about his personality, but he's not far off from being able to potentially help us in the majors as a left-handed hitter. For a 29th pick in a draft, I think you definitely could do worse than Bashirs, but my hope is that there might be someone else we like even better. Another left-handed hitting college center fielder is Coy Simmons out of Southern Mississippi. Also not looking for a ton of money. A little bit better range. Not quite as good a base runner. Does have high leadership and adaptability. And potentially a little bit better bat. Think he can be well above average in every category if he does reach his full potential. Obviously, no guarantees about that, but Coy Simmons, similar to Mr. Bashirs, is an interesting prospect to consider at number 29. Two other 4.5-star ceiling high school prospects. Joe Peterson, 18-year-old catcher, goes to George M. Steinbrenner High School. Respectable defensive catcher, although not really the profile I typically like. Not a lot of speed, does have a high work ethic. Potentially an excellent home run bat. And then left fielder Brad Castro, also a 4.5-star ceiling. Another guy with potentially really interesting home run power. Left-handed hitting, corner outfielder with average speed. Almost think I like the college guys better than Castro. Peterson could be interesting, but there are five-star potential prospects we need to talk through and look at as well. And we've already talked a little bit about Alfredo Sandoval, who we were projected to take with this pick. He is on the board. Wasn't sure that he would be. The bat, if it reaches his full potential, is incredible. I question whether anyone's going to really reach their full potential. As we talked about, don't love him defensively. Not a great base runner and has some personality quirks, but 80 contact with 70 home run power if he reaches his full potential is definitely the type of ceiling that could make you want to take a guy. Center fielder Ronnie Mernon, left-handed hitting high school outfielder. High loyalty and work ethic, low financial ambition. Looks more like a corner outfielder than a center fielder. Decent speed. Really good contact and eye with solid gap power. Looking for decent money. Was Nernan one of the top 5 guys? I think he must have been, because that profile seems that profile was very familiar to me. So Mernon was considered to be the number 4 prospect at the start of this draft. I felt like I know it was only a few minutes ago when I was looking at him. My memory isn't what it's always been, but I felt like that profile looked very familiar. Third baseman Dave Hurt. High leadership, adaptability, and work ethic. That's a great combination. Looks like a third base type profile. He is also 6'2", could certainly play first base. Potentially an above average offensive player if he reached his full potential. Shortstop Kurt Hall, a potential two-way player. High intelligence. contact with plus home run power is interesting. The durability is interesting. The infield ratings are fine, not exceptional, but could definitely play multiple infield positions. And then pitching wise, we think his stuff, his control and his stamina could all be average-ish to a little bit above. Average stuff, average movement, slightly above average control if it all worked out. Warrior Hall is a two-way guy. Interesting to think about. And then the last guy on the board is the center fielder, Mike Chapman. Left-handed hitting center fielder, solid speed, solid range, pretty good bunter, and potentially above average bat, albeit with an average eye, even if he reaches his full potential. So certainly some interesting position players, and if we wanted to go for kind of a hybrid situation, we could go with the shortstop Kurt Hall, who would also give us a pitching prospect. Best case scenario for him, unless we get some talent change randomness in our favor, is probably fifth starter, maybe a fourth starter if everything worked out perfectly. So in theory, you probably want more than a fifth starter with your first round pick, but fifth starter who could also play a number of infield positions and be a pretty good contact hitter with a little bit of home run pop, who's pretty strong, healthy, and durable. It's certainly something to think about. There's actually a fair number of position players I'm kind of intrigued by, so would love some thoughts from the Worldwide Scouting Department on what you might do in the draft if you were in my position. And if you've got any thoughts on the opportunity set that I outlined in the trade market, would love to hear those as well. As we sit here on July 11th, the Rangers have been playing just as poorly as us, so we're still only 2 out in the division. Our lead on the final wild card spot has fallen to just 5.5 games. Ortega third in the league in hitting, third in the league in batter war. Chase Dora and Jesus Saldana 2.3 in ERA, and the youngster Chuck Huntley leading the league in saves in his first year as our closer. So it has been a solid season for the A's thus far, hoping to perhaps supplement the roster over the next 3 weeks before the trade deadline, and hoping to supplement the roster for the long term in the draft, which we'll be focusing on in our next episode. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.